All right, well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Baker Institute for Public Policy. It's great to see so many people here. I know it's, Houston is, there's lots to do in Houston, so we very much appreciate you coming here and visiting us and listening. I think it's one of these kind of only in Houston a type of crowds. I'm very surprised to see this many people here, and for a kind of a wonky book that looks at a faraway region of the globe, lo and behold, here you are. I was surprised that a colleague of mine wrote an equally wonky book about domestic politics in Iran, and also got a very big turnout. Probably some of the same folks that are here tonight. So, one of the great things about this city. So I'm just going to launch right into the book. I think we had a little slight mix-up with the introduction, and talk about a bit about my new book, and then take questions. So I'm a research fellow here at the Baker Institute. I've been here for about 5 years. I did my PhD prior to that at Cambridge University, and prior to that, I had a almost 2-decade career as a journalist. Worked in the Persian Gulf region, and then while I was doing my PhD on this subject, also spent a lot of time in that region. I worked in lots of countries around the Gulf, Afghanistan and Iraq as well, and had a couple of years at a small newspaper here in Texas as well in that career. So the book, Energy Kingdoms, that you saw out there is based on my PhD thesis that I did. I finished about 5 years ago. I've been working on this for a while since then, kind of reshaping it into a more readable fashion. It looks in detail at energy issues in those 6 Persian Gulf monarchies, so Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, and Bahrain. But rather than looking solely at their role in supplying the world with energy, my book looks internally and really focuses on their own domestic demand for energy. I think that's where it's a little different than most of what you see on the Gulf. So I'm going to break my talk down tonight into 3 themes. First, I'll cover a bit of history. Second, we'll look at this issue of runaway energy consumption that I focus on. And third, we'll look at we'll kind of finish up with the vexing issue of climate change in the Gulf. So, not so long ago, cities in the Gulf looked like this, okay? Now, they look like this, okay? Like this, and like this. This is Riyadh, the same city that I showed you in that first photo. And this transformation did not really take that long. This is Dubai, right around 1960. So if any of you have been to Dubai, you can tell this is about 1959 or 1960 because the creek there has been dredged. You can see the new land, on the far side of the bank there. And that took place right around 1959. Of course, that was all there was to Dubai then. And now it looks more like this. Okay, so it's really a remarkable level of development in a pretty short time. What I think is more remarkable is that these guys, these traditional ruling families, managed to push their countries through this development and hang on to power, okay, or their sons or grandsons. So despite all this change, including mass immigration, these same families still hold absolute power today. And they really did this in defiance of academic predictions of their demise, right? In the 50s and 60s, a lot of academics argued that these ruling systems were going to be anachronisms pretty quickly, that once these countries got wealthy and educated, their citizens wouldn't put up with them any longer. Didn't turn out to be the case. So if you want to put this in a useful context for us tonight, you might think about a counterfactual that had the Native American tribes retaining absolute power in North America despite all the immigration and upheaval. Now, not a perfect corollary there, but just a way of thinking about the remarkable nature of this. So the way that these guys have ruled, even before oil, has always revolved around patronage, basically giving people stuff. So before oil, patronage depended on the sheikh's ability to squeeze funds from parties that sought access into the region. Okay, so that might have been rents paid by foreign powers, maybe the British government or the Ottoman government, or in the case of Saudi Arabia, they had access to Hajj pilgrims that paid a small fee to visit the holy sites, and that was the main source of funds for the Saudi king in the top center, Ibn Saud, the first Saudi king. So in the 1930s, the competition for access to oil started to zero in on the Gulf. And there were some big discoveries being made, first in Bahrain, then in Kuwait, then in Saudi Arabia in 1938. And it quickly became apparent that these hermit kingdoms were the perfect petro-states, right? You had just one man that called the shots. So you just visited the ruler's diwan, and that was your only stop. There were no veto wielders, within a bureaucracy. You had no private claims on the oil or on the land above. Most of it was just open grazing land. You had these rulers that were willing to cede huge concessions for very little. So the Saudi concession here is a third larger than the state of Texas. And of course, the geology turned out to be unbeatable. And I think for our purposes tonight, what is also crucial is that there was just about zero domestic demand for oil, right? So that meant that all of it could be exported. So oil was really of little use in the region at that time. Transportation was powered by animals or by the wind. People used biomass for cooking and for heat. So you had these, mainly U.S. and British companies that won these concessions, very lucrative concessions that worked pretty well for them for a few decades. But as the host governments began to understand the scale of national wealth that they'd basically consigned to foreign control, those concession terms became an embarrassment. And over time, the host governments began to unwind them. All right, so in 1973, the U.S. famously stepped in to rearm Israel, helping Israel defeat Syria and Egypt in the 1973 war. Whoop, I think I missed my notes there, sorry. Let me back up a little bit here. In the Middle East, this nationalization period came about alongside a major geopolitical confrontation. So the Arab host countries had made an issue of U.S. backing for Israel, and had become a kind of an irritant in what were otherwise pretty good relations. The Saudi King Faisal, pictured here, was particularly frustrated that his requests for a more balanced approach in Washington had basically been ignored. So, as I said, in 1973, the U.S. rearmed Israel and helping them win the 1973 war against Syria and Egypt. King Faisal was ready and retaliated. And he and the Arab OPEC members raised oil prices. They cut off shipments to the U.S., and they most devastatingly cut their own oil production by 5% per month. And the timing of all this was really a masterstroke. It might have been coincidental, but it was pretty devastating to oil importing countries. Some of those nationalizations of that process that I was speaking about had already been completed by 1973, 1974. Some would be completed shortly afterward. I guess the laggard was Saudi Arabia itself, which took 60% of Aramco by 1974, but didn't take that last 40% until 1980. So the embargo and the nationalizations really just brought an enormous shift in the terms of the crude oil trade. It was really a spectacular transfer of wealth and power from the West, oil importing countries, to the East, if you will. Some of the major effects, I discussed this in pretty good detail in my book, but some of the major effects to get your head around was the price of oil quadrupled in very short period of time, and the nationalization process meant that a bigger share of those oil rents was going to the producer countries. So the combined effects meant that the amount of revenues flowing to these producer countries went up by an incredible amount, right? So in the case of Saudi Arabia, revenues jumped 40-fold over a decade, from about $650 million a year to almost $27 billion a year. So, this was a crucial turning point for the Gulf, and pretty short order, these countries became rich. And as we know, there are few indicators that predict growth in energy demand like growth in income. So I think a lot of us in this room remember this era, and we know how these changes played out in oil markets and how they played out in importing countries. We want to look at how this played out in domestic policy in the Gulf. Now, as I mentioned, the sheikhs had been using patronage to keep their subjects loyal. After the embargo, they suddenly had a lot more patronage. And of course, the citizens, had greater expectations. So one of the most convenient forms of patronage became energy products and services. So in the 1970s, the governments in the Gulf began fixing prices for energy products at very low levels. They did this, partly because they'd just gotten this windfall. They also was partly due to, still pretty low administrative capacity in these states and these governments. Subsidies are easy. And they also did this partly to solidify support for some of the ruling families themselves. So what you had was prices that were left untouched for decades. So in my work, I really focused in on electricity prices and gathered as much data as I could, historical data on electricity prices. I couldn't find evidence that any of these 6 countries raised prices on electricity for at least 40 years. And in fact, the only changes came was when prices were lowered. Now, this chart just shows 2 countries, it starts out in Jeddah in western Saudi Arabia. But you can see in the Kuwait, which is the line on the bottom, they lowered their electricity tariff to less than 1 cent per kilowatt hour in 1966, and that price just stayed fixed for more than 50 years, okay? They're starting to tinker with it now, but really just, very long a period of low prices. So academics saw this, and they argued that this meant that subsidies on it, that these subsidies were rights, okay? They were rights of citizenship. Touch them, and political support for the regimes would unravel. Now, of course, outside the region, when energy prices rose, people changed their behavior. If you were exposed to these prices, you went and insulated your house, or you bought a smaller car, or you bought a more efficient appliance, or you just used that stuff less. In the Gulf, people didn't face these same incentives to change their behavior. The governments, their own governments, were insulating them from international prices and signals from those prices. So you had basically a perfect storm of demand. You had these very low subsidized prices, you had lots of immigration coming into the Gulf, and you had this really big growth in income, sort of the trifecta, if you will. So demand for energy doubled every decade at least. So, after about 40 years of this, these once primitive kingdoms in the Gulf became huge consumers of energy with some of the world's highest levels of per capita demand. Now, this chart shows Saudi Arabia in the black line there, the sort of the thick black line that kind of comes up from a low base here. That is oil consumption inside Saudi Arabia measured against some other large oil consumers. Saudi Arabia, amazingly, is now the number 5 oil consumer in the world. Okay, there's only 2 countries that consume significantly more oil than Saudi Arabia, and that is China and the United States. Over the past few years, The Saudis have passed Brazil, Germany, and Russia. They're closing in on Japan, as you can see here. And it's really disproportionate. This, Saudi Arabia is about, based on population, they're around number 41 in the world based on population. So this surprised a lot of people, including the International Energy Agency in Paris. In 2008, while we were living in Dubai, the IEA issued this report that announced that most of the Gulf monarchies could no longer supply their own needs in natural gas. So this was really the event, this emergence of this report that sparked my personal interest in this topic. It really was the topic that I started looking into, and I thought this would make a perfect PhD topic for me, and I really examined it, over about 4.5 years doing a PhD, and I continue to work on it now. It is a fascinating topic. A lot of my research at the Baker Institute, besides just this book, has been on this topic. We always thought that the Gulf was a supply region, and I had until really, until then. And it was clear that that was starting to change. The Gulf was not just a supply region. It was becoming a demand region, and a big demand region. So the reserves were still big, right, and are still big. But it was that an increasing share of their production was being diverted into the domestic market. And since these domestic prices were subsidized, that was a revenue killer for these countries. So a barrel of oil that might have sold outside of Saudi Arabia for $50 or maybe $100 would sell in the kingdom for just $5, okay? So the export-dependent economy was basically being cannibalized. And disturbingly, the political support for these ruling families was supposedly bound up in these subsidies. So the regimes were afraid to take them away. But for them, the flip side of that was even worse, right? If the policymakers didn't do something about this growing demand, it would divert ever more oil into the domestic economy, and they, at some point, wouldn't have anything left to export. So, since these revenues are really the lifeblood of the economy and the political system, policymakers knew it was going to be tough, but they had to do something about it. So my surveys of policymakers clearly demonstrated this, but they also revealed that policymakers were afraid. They were afraid to do this. In 2011, a lot of these countries had been producing plans to reform subsidies. One of them actually went ahead and changed prices. That was Dubai. But just as this was happening, the Arab Spring broke out, okay? And regimes in the Gulf went from being afraid to touch prices to being petrified, right? They thought that if they went and took away their, upset their citizens by taking away their rightful cheap energy, the Arab Spring might infect their countries too. So finally, by 2014, the dam broke, and you have this flood of changes. So after 40 years of nothing or almost nothing, you had a sea change in thinking about energy pricing in the Gulf. This is, I don't know if you can read that, it's pretty small type. This is a chart from my book. I just put it on the slide here. So what changed? What allowed this to happen? Well, three things. I get into much more detail on this again in my book, but the first thing that happened was that Arab Spring that petrified rulers so much basically fizzed out. It kind of devolved into this protracted chaos, in Iraq and in Yemen, in Syria, and in Libya. And you had the rise of ISIS and this kind of general insecurity. You had some terrorist attacks in some previously very stable countries, including Kuwait. It really pushed people to rally around their leaders and made them more interested in security, less interested in democracy. The second thing that happened was, as you can see on that gray line there, that represents the oil price. They plummeted in 2014, especially after that fateful OPEC meeting in November 2014 when the Saudis declined to cut. So, when oil prices are down in the Gulf, you can feel it in the air, right? And there are some expectations that there's going to be some austerity. And that really gave governments some political cover to take action. The third thing was that about 3 months after that OPEC meeting, the king of Saudi Arabia, King Abdullah, passed away. And he was, the new king, Salman, who took power, was far less cautious with domestic policy making. And King Salman put his 30-year-old son, Mohammed bin Salman, or MBS, in charge of a huge portion of the economy. Now, one of the first things that MBS did, one of the best things he did, I think, in my opinion, was to raise energy prices. First, he did it in 2016, and then again in 2018. Now, lots of other places did the same thing, but the Saudi subsidy reforms were the largest, the deepest, and the broadest. So prices in the Gulf, energy prices, are still low by international standards, but we're starting to see some changes in demand in the region. And I get into lots of detail about this in my book, but the big issue, the big takeaway here is that Saudi oil demand finally looks like it's plateauing and maybe even starting to trend downward ever so slightly. Now the Gulf, the other monarchies, most of them haven't seen quite the same level of demand response yet, but of course none of them have gone quite as far as the Saudis. So energy demand in the Gulf, I don't want to give you the idea that it's been solved. It's still problematic, but these countries, these governments are starting to turn the corner on this issue. I think they've really planted a flag here. They've established that these subsidies on energy they're not rights of citizenship. They actually can be taken away. They can be rolled back, and that I think that and that it's in the national interest. And I think citizens understand that it's in the national interest for them to do so. So it's I think it's momentous. However, moving on to the last topic, just as these kingdoms are coming to grips with this one potentially existential problem, another one comes along, and that is the issue of climate change. For the Gulf, I think climate change is an even tougher problem for two big reasons. Okay, so since fossil fuel emissions are the main cause, they fear that the solution involves selling a lot less oil and gas, and that is going to damage their industry and their economy, right? The solution for them might be worse than the disease, as it were. The second reason why climate is such a tough issue is that the Persian Gulf is also on the front lines of climate damage. Okay, so summers in the Gulf, any of you have spent them there, they're already pretty hot. In the summer of 2016, the highs in Kuwait City and in Basra in southern Iraq went up above 129 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, I mean that is, I think it set a new record for the Eastern Hemisphere, but that is a hot afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. If things get much worse, if they keep going down this road, temperatures will go beyond the human body's ability to cool itself, and that's what this chart shows here. Those cities that I've circled are all on the coastline of the Persian Gulf. And what this chart shows is that by sort of 2070, 2080 time frame, at business as usual carbon emissions, some of these cities could have heat and humidity combinations that are beyond human endurance. So a message here is that if the Gulf rulers want their people to be able to survive during a summer blackout, they need the world to get emissions in check. So right now, I think policymakers, what we hear out of the Gulf, the policymakers are really worried about this sort of existential climate issue. Number one, that the coming clampdown on fossil fuels, if it materializes, is going to undermine their economies. But really, I think they need to look at the totality of the issue here. They've got bifurcated interests when it comes to climate. On the one hand, they need the action on these, so they need to put together a sophisticated policy. So to conclude, and sort of the way my book concludes is with a pretty detailed look about what they're doing about this problem. I don't want to give it all away here, but I'll give you a few hints. I think some of it is pretty smart. The first thing is major investments into non-combustion uses for oil and gas. Okay, so that mainly means petrochemicals, right? So using oil and gas as a feedstock for plastic and products that don't involve burning it. Secondly, cleaning up the upstream. Okay, so unlike us, the Saudis have almost completely stopped flaring, and their oil has the lowest carbon footprint of any global crude oil. It's the closest thing we have to clean oil, right, at this point. But one way or another, it looks like climate change is going to disrupt life in the Gulf, right? So on initial look at it, it looks like a lose-lose almost. So if the global climate action succeeds, Gulf economies and political systems are going to have to find another way to survive, right? And that is part of the reason behind this big economic diversification push. We're seeing them finally taking economic diversification seriously. And if climate policies fall short, I think that this region faces really an unwinnable confrontation with an increasingly hostile environment. So either way, I think it's going to be a challenging road for the Persian Gulf. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is all I've got. I'd be happy to take questions if anybody has any. We've got a couple of mics here. Not sure how much time we've got for questions. Maybe half an hour-ish, 20 minutes. But if you do have a question, please come on up to the mic. And introduce yourself too, please.
Oh, Ali Oktay from Platts. I have a question about the energy mix of Saudi Arabia. With the disrupted demand for the high sulfur fuel oil, we already hear from a couple of sources that desalination facilities and the power generation facilities in Saudi Arabia will use more of the high sulfur fuel oil because of,
right. They can't
Russian
export
demand. Yeah. So with all these factors, that is making so encouraging for them to keep doing what they are doing. Do you think they're going to change their energy mix and try to make some aggressive changes in that?
I do. I mean, so the questioner is talking about this is IMO 2020, so the International Maritime Organization's regulations on basically the fuel that ships burn with, the fuel oil with a high sulfur content, forcing them to reduce the sulfur content of that fuel. Lots of folks are wondering where that fuel is going to go. I mean, are all these refineries going to upgrade, or are some of these refineries that produce this stuff going to sell it to other markets? I mean, the Saudis do burn a lot of fuel oil now in their power plants, and crude oil, by the way. Almost half their power, although it's a declining share, comes from fuel. I mean, this past summer they were burning, I think they went over 1 million barrels a day at one point. I think in July, of fuel oil and crude oil. I don't know whether they're going to burn high sulfur fuel oil. I suspect they probably will, but that's a guess. But I do think that we'll see that high sulfur fuel oil flowing into the power sectors in some developing countries.
Yeah, and just to clarify, I was just trying to make sure, do you think if they're going to wait till it comes to some drastic levels, or they're going to try to prevent it before it gets to those levels? You
mean their consumption of oil in the power sector? Oh yeah, the Saudi Aramco is laser focused on this issue. They're trying to bring the demand down, okay, by raising electricity prices, as I showed. They're also trying to replace it with natural gas, and they're sort of attacking it from all sides, raising prices, trying to stifle demand, and finding alternate fuels to substitute for oil and power.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sir.
My name is Michel Gossan. I'm from Houston, originally Lebanese. So I understand a little bit about the background. My question is regarding Ru'ya 2030 that the Saudi king wanted to launch. to get his independence from the oil revenue. Do you think that they can continue on their dependency on the oil revenue as you presented, or do you think that they will be away from it in the next few years?
So, you always hear that that these countries should diversify away from oil, right? You hear that, we need to diversify. In Saudi Arabia, people don't usually express it that way. They say, we need to diversify beyond oil, right? So there's a distinction there. I think Saudi Arabia's plan is to clean up its oil sector, continues, we don't have another a viable transportation fuel at this point. And, even as personal vehicles maybe go to some transportation is electrified, we're still going to have heavy cargo and aviation sectors that are going to be dependent on oil, right? And you still have demand sectors elsewhere. So I think the Saudis are making a strong argument by cleaning up their upstream and taking some of these other measures that that the low-cost supplier should be the supplier of last resort, and as demand plateaus and starts to dwindle eventually, that the Saudis are still major players in that market. Thanks, sir.
Yeah, I'm Neil Hurley from Houston. My question is, do you know what fraction of the domestic energy use is for water desalination? And having lived in the region, we never heard a single word about water conservation. And I wonder if people have recognized that and they're starting to think about that now.
I don't, off the top of my head, know the fraction, but it's a lot, okay? But, a lot of the desalination plants are cogeneration plants, right? So they're producing power with the waste heat as well, so they do both. Consumption of water in the Gulf is, it's pretty shocking. I think, I can't remember if it's an average of all 6 or if it's just one of the 6. There's a stat in my book anyway about this, that their consumption is somewhere around the same level as that of Canada, right? Which is a high water consumer, but just happens to be, have a large portion of its surface area covered by fresh water. So I think there's also a major understanding that this can't go on, and that's another reason behind this subsidy reform. So water is looked upon as like an energy source because so much energy is consumed in desalinating it that, one of the first major reforms, and one of the ones that caused the biggest uproar, was finally imposing a price on water. These traditional sheikhs, that was, in the old days, that was one of their key jobs, and that was how they got to keep their job, was by providing water for their subjects. And so, they took that role pretty seriously, even after they started desalinating water, and they still provided it for free in most of these countries. And imposing a price on that, really went against the grain, and there were a lot of people that protested. The Saudi minister of water got fired over this issue, and there's a big uproar in all the countries that started pricing it. But you are seeing, right away. When Dubai put a price on water for the first time, it found per account demand went down by like 9%. Right away, because people found leaks. They asked their gardeners to stop leaving the hose running overnight. All sorts of ways to reduce it. So
yeah, might be a good thesis topic for one of the students. Yeah,
indeed.
Good.
Thank you, sir.
Yes. It seems like the Americans are going on the footsteps of the British of divide and conquer. And that's literally what we are doing in the Middle East. Those who don't abide by our rules, we wage wars on them. And that's what the problems happening in Iraq and Syria, and we are paying Saudis, giving them all kind of weapons to create big havoc and terror in Yemen, and it's all paid for by the Saudis, whether they like it or they don't. We are telling them you're going to pay for it. And this is a major problem that's going to arise in the future, and the Arab so-called Spring or Arab, in my opinion, that was the groundwork for a revolution to change the whole Middle East, but then it failed.
Do you have a question on this, or?
Well, yes, sir. See, no, please, there's no joke about this. This is very serious. It's because I could go and ask you a dozen questions of what you said, because I disagree with it. I come from the Middle East. I've been here for 57 years. But there are a lot of errors. I don't want to cover that.
Well, let's chat about it after then. Maybe you can point some out to me.
Well, sir, how are you going to stop the Americans keep on supporting these leaders that none of them have finished even sixth grade education?
Well, all right. Look. I mean, I'll address that, but you know, I mean, the topic of my discussion is different than your point you're making. But the point is taken. You know, U.S.-Saudi relations is a complex a field, right? And there are a lot of interests that we don't have in common with Saudi Arabia. And you know, our countries used to be aligned. We were very strong Cold War allies, and the demise of the Soviet Union in 1991 really took away one of the key strategic, you know, I guess, drivers for that very close strategic relationship. And now that relationship has gotten a little bit, you know, less tight. It's gotten a bit more transactional. We agree on some things. We disagree on others. One administration will have a closer relationship than another administration. So I'll hold it for there now, and I'll look for you in the afterward. Sir.
Can Ercan, energy analyst from Turkish consulate in Houston. Great presentation about your book. After your book, maybe very recent significant changes happened that may have some ramifications for global oil markets. You were a journalist, so Jamal Khashoggi was brutally killed in a consulate. So how do you assess the post-Jamal Khashoggi environment can have ramifications for the U.S. and Saudi relations in terms of global oil markets?
Yeah, I mean, so the Jamal Khashoggi murder has had huge ramifications for U.S.-Saudi relations. I mean, it's, I mean, I think, you know, the Trump administration has managed to hang on, but you know, Trump is under a lot of pressure to downgrade ties and to cut ties and sanction Saudi Arabia. I mean, we've imposed some small sanctions on individuals, but I think there's a lot of pressure to do more than that. I actually knew Jamal Khashoggi. He came to my office once in Dubai, just walked in unannounced, and we had a long chat and you know, very interesting, fun chat when he was the editor of the Arab News. So you know, I was you know, extremely upset and shocked by you know, what happened to him, getting murdered in, you know, a consulate in your country. So so yeah, I mean, that has been a major a roadblock in you know, the Trump administration's attempts to revive ties that, you know, I think, you know, deteriorated under the Obama administration. And, I mean, full stop. So, thanks, sir.
Gene Osbach here in Houston. There's always been questions about when you look at 50 to 70 years out about how long the Saudi oil will last. Has there been any indication that their desire to control their internal energy consumption is not only to maintain the rents that you talk about, but also to prepare themselves for some point down there that the oil demand or oil volume may actually decline?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. Yeah, I mean, I think that you know, this big push at economic diversification is, you know, I mean, Saudi Aramco officials will tell you this, that you know, that this big push, this big investment into petrochemical capacity is a climate hedge, and you know, it's a hedge against plateauing and a possible decline in global oil consumption. So, yeah. So you mean from the reserves?
From the reserves.
I mean, they just had the reserves audited by, you know, a international audit body. I forget who it was, and you know, their reserves are what they say they are. I mean, you know, in all of my visits and all my conversations with Saudi Aramco employees, I've never heard anyone, you know, questioning that. And now, you know, we've got this audit, so I think that really. I think that answers that question.
Okay, thank you.
Dan.
Dan Cohan, professor of environmental engineering here at Rice. Heard you speak about these issues a couple of years ago. It's really congratulations on having this become a book and giving a great talk tonight. Curious what you see as the role for solar in the decades ahead.
Well, this is you know, the question that's always getting kicked down the road in this region. It gets talked about a lot. I mean, I was just looking at you know, Arab News today, you know, from a Jeddah-based newspaper that actually Jamal Khashoggi used to edit. You know, there's another story about, you know, this booming solar in Saudi Arabia. You know, if you look at the production of electric power by means other than fossil fuel in Saudi Arabia or in any of the Gulf countries, there's no country yet, at least as of 2017, right? There was no country producing more than 0.1% of its electricity by solar or any other renewable means, right? So Abu Dhabi has 4 nuclear power plants that are delayed, but they should be coming on stream soon with 5.6 gigawatts of power generation capacity. So we'll have some zero carbon power generation from that. They do have some small solar installations. They've got some pretty big ones under construction in Dubai and in Abu Dhabi. The Saudis have issued a couple of tenders, and there's a few under production. There's also a small wind farm under production being built in sort of the northwestern corner of Saudi Arabia. So there'll be a little bit coming on, but you know, nothing like what you'd expect. I think, you know, one of the problems that they're facing is electricity demand is still growing, so they're still chasing, you know, a moving target. And especially in the cities on the Gulf Coast, you've got sort of a dual peak, a demand peak daily. You've got one in the afternoon when the sun's out, and then you've got another peak in the evening after the sun goes down, when, you know, really that bank of humidity just washes in off the Gulf. And you know, the argument is that you'd still have to build just as much conventional power capacity to back up the solar. That's the argument that I always get in the Gulf. So it hasn't taken off as much as a lot of us were hoping or expected. Ma'am.
Hi, my name is Sri Lurie. I'm a student here studying economics, and following the trend of Saudi Arabia-related questions, I'd like to ask you if you think that Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 is adequately addressing climate change, and if its privatization initiatives are addressing climate change and energy diversification.
Well, you know, I think, as I pointed out in my presentation, I think, you know, the Saudi focus for now on climate change is mostly around the economic damage that it fears to its own economy. I don't think, or, you know, the other Gulf monarchies as well, I don't think they are adequately focusing on, you know, the geographic or climactic issues that they'll face in the future, and they're starting to face now. Now, that said, all of these countries have signed the Paris Accords. They've all issued their NDCs, their goals for reducing. The Saudi goal is a pretty modest one. And actually, a lot of folks think that the Saudi goal, their Paris goal, they'll probably reach it ahead of time just by what I showed you tonight, by these changing energy prices and reducing demand from that. The Saudis in climate negotiations, and some of the other Gulf monarchies, Kuwait, for example, they have taken a pretty simplistic kind of obstructionist stance to climate negotiations, trying to block things or delay or use procedural tactics to. And they've returned to that in the last meeting in Poland, but there's been a hiatus, let's say, and they've been taking a much more sort of considered, nuanced approach. Some of the things that I mentioned here, some of the things in my book also. So I'm hopeful that they'll come around. I don't think the Saudis and the Gulf monarchies really, there's other oil producers that have an easy, I think they're going to have a much easier time with climate. So if you think about Russia, Canada, Norway, Mongolia, big coal producer, these countries might actually benefit. They might actually have a benefit from climate change. They'll have, more of their land mass will be arable. Some of the seas will be cleared of ice, and they can access them. And I think the folks that are, these equatorial oil producers are going to have a much tougher time. I think they may have to develop different strategies. Sir.
Larry Blake from Houston. I'd like you to comment more on why you think that the Arab oil is the best. That as a chemical engineer, what we always did is that we had to change the carbon-hydrogen ratio so it got in the range where it could be transportation fuel. And that the Arab medium in particular, you either had to increase the hydrogen in it with hydrotreaters, or you had to take the coke out with the coker. And what I see now is that when you look at the oil that we're getting from in the U.S. and around the world, it has a better range of carbon-hydrogen ratio. And so how do you say that theirs is a better oil?
Well, you are outstripping my knowledge of chemistry here, sir. I'll bet there's somebody here that can help you on that one, but it's not me.
So. The other comment, when I started in the business, oil was $3.50 a barrel, and when I retired, it was $100 a barrel. So,
wow.
I made a living off of it. And
I'll bet, yeah. Thanks. Ma'am.
Susan Harris, Houston.
Sorry, I'm just going to take these last four, and then I think there's some books out there. If anybody's got one, I'd be happy to sign it if you'd like. But we'll take these last four, and we'll call it an evening if that's all right with you all. Ma'am, sorry.
Relative to the other Gulf nations, can you comment on Qatar and their plans for the future in terms of energy diversification and in terms of limiting energy use, water consumption, et cetera?
Yeah, so Qatar is really the outlier in the Gulf. And there's a section in my book on this. A lot of what I just presented you tonight does not apply to the Qataris, right? So their citizen population is somewhere under about 300,000 people, so it's tiny, okay? So, only about 15% of the population are actually citizens, and the rest are there on, sort of 3 to 6 year work visas. They are sitting on the world's single largest non-associated gas field, and so they do not have the same energy issues. Their oil reserves are depleting, but they have so much natural gas and natural gas liquids that they are not in the same issue. They don't face the same crunch. Now they're exposed to international prices and gas prices like everybody else, and oil prices. They just left OPEC, that you might have heard, because they no longer saw their interests, and I think they might have lost some of their stature in there due to this kind of, this imbroglio with some of their neighbors. But they're not under the same pressure. So Qatari citizens still get as much free electricity as they want. So I often joke with Qataris that they could open an aluminum smelter in their backyard if they so chose. Unlimited free electricity, unlimited free amounts of water. They've raised prices, but they've got a separate tariff for citizens and a zero tariff, and a separate tariff for non-citizens. And those prices have been going up. So the majority of people living in Qatar are paying higher prices, including on transportation fuel. I believe they've linked their diesel and gasoline prices to international prices.
Any thoughts about the plans that they've had for the last maybe 5 or 6 years on economic diversification? Are they out ahead of the Gulf or in keeping?
No, I'd say they're probably, they're under less pressure to diversify. I mean, gas also is, it's a lower carbon source of power. It's seen as this kind of this bridge fuel for renewables around the world to drive out coal and provide a source of power that can sync with renewables. So I don't think they're under the same pressure. Sir.
Thank you. Adam Babaker from Houston, but originally from Darfur, Sudan. My question pretty much is in relation to human rights. So given the fact that oil is the source of wealth, and having that wealth, Gulf countries tend to use this wealth to disrupt and send chaos to other countries, mainly Yemen. I'm from Darfur. I'm a genocide survivor. And a lot of young men were recruited in Sudan, Darfur, basically to fight in Yemen. And Qatar waging pretty much war against Darfuris. And I think the oil is factor, its wealth is factor. My question to you, how long those countries can sustain this international influence?
Well, so there's a lot of folks that believe that that oil is linked to lots of bad things. So civil wars in general, even repression of women and minorities. There's a book by a political scientist from University of California, Michael Ross, who wrote about this. I think probably make interesting reading for you. You might find some interesting cases there that reflect your own experience. I argue against that sometimes. The experience in the Gulf countries themselves, their domestic experience. These countries were extremely impoverished. They weren't much different. They're probably less developed than Sudan was. I compare them. If they didn't have oil, I point to a country like Somalia or Eritrea. But actually, those countries were probably even more developed than the Gulf monarchies, right? At the time they discovered oil, and they used oil. They kept their autocratic systems, but they also raised life expectancy by, in some cases, 30 years, right? So people are actually living about 30 years longer. Education, access to health care, housing, paved roads, any kind of development indicator you can think of has improved in these countries. So there's definitely, there's good and bad, and there are, different countries have different experiences with it. So I guess.
So basically, the wealth, oil pretty much is course for the victims and capital for those Gulf countries?
Sorry?
What I'm saying, in sense that the oil helps the Gulf countries to develop, right? And in the same...
Can I just stop you there for a second? I want to get to these last two questions, and I need to move outside. I'd be happy to chat with you offline here outside, if you don't mind. Sir.
Yes, Fritz Glover. I left the petrochemical industry 35 years ago or thereabouts, and used to visit Saudi Arabia. And at that time, the Russians were not involved in any way, and also natural gas was not something that was a subject of interest. And I'm wondering today what you see the Russian involvement in the Saudi situation on OPEC, and then the role of natural gas. How's the future going to develop in the next 35 years, say?
It's a fascinating topic, really. We actually have a PhD student who's been modeling this, and he argues that shale has pushed Saudi and Russia together, and that's one of the downsides of shale development in the U.S. Becoming a huge producer of oil, really undercut market power of OPEC and forced them to bring in the other big producer that was outside OPEC that had been until then basically piggybacking on OPEC's cuts, and brought them in to regain their market power. So, this was kind of unthinkable during the Cold War, right? I mean, Saudi Arabia and the Soviet Union were, mortal enemies. I mean, the Soviet Union was anti-monarchy and, officially atheist, and of course, was supporting rebel movements the world over. So, the Saudis, worked in lockstep with us. Now that whole dynamic is changing. We're seeing closer political ties now as well. We're seeing lots of visits. We're seeing the relationship described as strategic now by both sides. Very interesting. Where it goes, they just sort of formalized their relationship. There was a story in the Wall Street Journal today about that, actually. So this relationship is starting to be formalized. So very interesting.
LNG side of this, the liquefied natural gas, we have big plants which are just starting in Louisiana and so on. And do you see that as having a major impact on this petrochemical and oil business at all?
I don't see it affecting the Gulf so much other than as a source of supply, right? So these countries, most of them are short on natural gas, and they've, the two countries with most of it in the region are, on the naughty list of these guys. So, increasing number of U.S. LNG cargoes have been going to the UAE and Kuwait. Actually, they've become net importers of natural gas now since 2008, right? So, it's a source of supply for them. I think it holds prices down, allows them to keep using natural gas domestically.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, hi, Amin Bouchentoof from Parador Capital. I run an investment fund actually out of Abu Dhabi, so I thought it was very interesting, your lecture, having spent many decades there. What I was interested in getting your perspective on is the sovereign wealth fund aspect of energy. And so what a lot of people overlook is that most of this energy capital is being recycled into Western markets, OECD, emerging markets, specifically technology, energy, so energy tech, basically. And so I wanted to get your perspective on what you think that will have in the future for these monarchies and UAE in particular.
Yeah, it's not a subject I know a ton about, the sovereign wealth funds, but I think those are being used as, by the countries that have them as a key tool in, reducing some of the cyclical pressures they face from oil, but also in this diversification effort. I mean, they are trying to invest in things that, in some cases, run counter to their interests, right? So Tesla, for example, so if they see electric cars really succeeding, at least they've got a they don't have all their eggs in the in the gasoline and diesel basket. They unfortunately though don't produce that strategy doesn't produce a lot of jobs, and these countries have a big issue. They've got these capital intensive sectors. They need things that are and they all have unemployment issues, right? Except for maybe the small ones. Qatar doesn't face this so much, and so they need more labor intensive industries, and thus far the sovereign wealth funds aren't doing that. So it's part of their diversification solution, but I think it's a part that needs to be augmented with other things.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. All right, well, we'll call it an evening, and I'll see you outside. Thanks.